Have you ever noticed how some forms of social justice activism feel religious? Not just in their passion or moral intensity, but in the deeper sense, the emotional fervor, the rituals, the shared doctrines, the moral absolutism, and even the way institutions now seem to adopt and enforce these beliefs. In this video, I want to explore a question that's become increasingly relevant, but also increasingly sensitive. That is social justice activism, what some call wokeism, a kind of religion, or at least religious in its structure and behavior? Hello. For those new to this channel, my name is Hick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. And this is another episode of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. Before we go further, let me be very clear. I'm not using the word religion to discredit the movement. I don't think religion is inherently bad or irrational or oppressive. Quite the opposite. Religion can offer deep meaning, purpose, community, and moral vision. And so can activism. Also, I'm not saying that all people who care about social justice are caught up in something cult-like. Many are thoughtful, open-minded, and genuinely compassionate people. But some, particularly the most strident, the most militant, seem to exhibit behaviors that look and feel a lot like religious fundamentalism. And if we're going to understand what's happening in our culture, we need to look beyond the surface and ask, what deeper psychological and cultural dynamics are at play? One of those deeper forces may be the widespread decline of traditional religion in the West. As many societies became more secular, people still carry the same fundamental needs for belonging, for meaning, for moral clarity, for something greater than themselves. As Chesterton once famously put it, when men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything. End quote. There's a sense, a spiritual vacuum, a God-shaped hole that many modern people feel that must be filled. And when that need is met not by traditional religion, but by ideology, it can take on religious energy without the guardrails that healthy spiritual traditions often provide. To make sense of this phenomenon, I want to bring in some insight from religious studies. The scholar Ninian, a foundational figure in the academic study of religion, proposed that religion isn't just belief in God or the supernatural. It's a multidimensional phenomenon, expressed through emotion, ritual, doctrine, community, and institutional life. As Smart writes, quote, religion is not confined to the doctrinal or philosophical. It pervades the affective, the mythological, the ethical, the ritual, and the social. He further notes, quote, a religion typically involves not a set of beliefs, but also a distinctive worldview, ritual acts, moral codes, and a sense of belonging to a community that shares these values. Religious philosopher John Hick likewise emphasized religion's role in shaping how people make meaning and interpret moral reality. As he writes, quote, religion is, first of all, a system of symbols, myths, and rituals which serve to interpret the universe and human life and to order human existence in accordance with that interpretation. So, borrowing from what religious scholars have to say about it, I want to explore 4 key dimensions of religious life and how social justice ideology, particularly in its more zealous expressions, often mirrors them. These 4 are the psychological, the behavioral, the social, and the institutional. Now, I'm not the only one making this comparison between wokeism and religion. Writers like Jonathan Haidt, John McWhorter, and Andrew Doyle, none of whom are religious scholars, have all drawn similar connections. They've pointed out how modern identity activism can take on the feel of moral orthodoxy, a kind of secular religion complete with sacred values, heresies, rituals, and public shaming. As McWhorter puts it in his book, Woke Racism, quote, anti-racism has become not a political orientation, but a religion, complete with clergy, original sin, and an afterlife of cancellation. Jonathan Haidt, drawing on Durkheim, describes how some student movements have created, quote, sacred spaces where disagreement is seen not as debate, but as blasphemy. And Andrew Doyle, in The New Puritans, warns that we are living through a cultural moment in which, quote, a pseudo-religious movement has seized the institutions, unquote, and is enforcing conformity without the humility or self-awareness of traditional faiths. To date, no major religious scholar has formally declared social justice activism to be a religion, but still, the patterns are striking, and the deeper question is, what are the consequences of not recognizing those patterns? These four dimensions don't prove that something is a religion, but when all four are active, we're likely dealing with a powerful belief system, one that shapes identity, morality, and group behavior in ways that closely resemble religious life. Let's now look briefly at each one of these dimensions, the psychological and emotional dimension. Religion offers more than beliefs. It offers an inner world, a sense of meaning, identity, moral clarity, and emotional intensity. It tells us who we are, what's good, what's evil, and how to live. For many, social justice activism, especially in its more ideological expressions, does something very similar. It provides a moral worldview, a narrative of oppression and liberation, a framework in which the self is either guilty if privileged or righteous if oppressed. And with that framework comes a sense of moral purpose and often a sense of urgency, the feeling that everything is at stake and neutrality is complicity. There's also emotional intensity, confession, shame, repentance, public atonement, particularly for those in so-called dominant identity groups. There can be an internalized sense of guilt that mirrors the religious experience of original sin. The emotional texture of all this feels strikingly religious, but instead of sin and salvation, the language is privilege and allyship. Instead of grace, there is continual self-surveillance. Now, the behavioral dimension. Religions are not just about what people believe, they're about what people do to show and reinforce their belonging. There are rituals, moral codes, symbolic acts, public expressions of devotion, taboos, acts of penance. We see this in activist spaces as well. There's required use of specific language and pronouns, public acknowledgments of privilege or indigenous land stewardship, performative declarations of solidarity, protests, and social rituals that mark one as a true believer. There's also what you must not do. Ask the wrong questions, express the wrong kind of doubt, fail to post at the right time about the right issue. Those who deviate from the behavioral expectations can face social exclusion, digital mobbing, or even career consequences. These aren't just political acts. They're ritualized performances of moral belonging. And now the social or doctrinal dimension. Religions create moral communities held together by shared stories, values, and identities. Social justice ideology also creates a worldview. The world is divided into oppressors and oppressed. Power structures are embedded everywhere. Lived experience is the highest form of moral knowledge. Silence is violence. Words can cause trauma, and disagreement is harm. This becomes a doctrinal system, a way of seeing everything through a particular moral lens. And once adopted, that lens tends to interpret all events in ways that confirm the narrative. Group identity is reinforced and moral purity is policed. Those who fail to affirm the doctrine or who suggest an alternative framing may be cast out. As Douglas Murray observes in his book, The Madness of Crowds, quote, the demand for conformity in our society has become so powerful that even the slightest deviation from the accepted orthodoxy can result in social ostracism and professional ruin. unquote. He warns that what we're seeing is not simply activism, but, quote, a new religion with its own scriptures, blasphemies, and inquisitions, unquote. And finally, we come to the institutional dimension. Traditionally, in liberal societies, we've made a clear distinction between personal belief and public institutions. People are free to believe what they want, but we generally don't want our government, our schools, our workplace, or our media preaching religious doctrines, let alone enforcing them. That's why we separate church and state. It's why most people, regardless of their personal spirituality, would feel uncomfortable if their employer or their child's teacher started quoting scripture as moral authority. But here's the issue. When a belief system doesn't call itself a religion, yet behaves like one, it often flies under the radar, and that's what seems to be happening with social justice ideology. Its influence is now deeply embedded in universities through mandated DEI trainings and ideologically driven curricula, through corporations with HR protocols that sometimes function as moral compliance checks, through the media, where coverage often reflects a narrow set of approved narratives, and government, where policy, hiring, and speech regulation increasingly reflect activist frameworks. Often, people are required, formally or informally, to affirm these values or face consequences. The language is often secular, things like equity, inclusion, or anti-racism, but the emotional and moral force behind it can feel deeply dogmatic and religious. This is where the real concern arises. When any belief system, religious or secular, is smuggled into institutions and used to define what is acceptable thought or speech, we lose something essential. We lose the pluralism that keeps society open. We lose the freedom to dissent. And we lose the ability to question authority without being branded immoral. So, is wokeism a religion? Not officially. There's no deity, no temple, no sacred text. But in terms of how it functions emotionally, behaviorally, socially, and institutionally, there are unmistakable religious parallels. But even that might not be the most urgent question. The more pressing question is, when does a belief system stop being just religious in nature and become a cult? Scholars who study cults, like Roy Wallis, Stephen Hassan, and Eileen Barker, suggest that what separates cults from healthy religion is freedom. Stephen Hassan, a former cult member and leading expert in cult dynamics, developed what he calls the BITE, or BITE model: behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. According to Hassan, a group becomes cult-like when it seeks to control these four dimensions of human life: what people do, what information they can access, how they are allowed to think, and what emotions are acceptable. Many ideological environments, he warns, cross that line without realizing it. Roy Wallis defined cults as groups with a high level of commitment, an exclusivist worldview, and a tendency to demonize outsiders. Eileen Barker adds that cults often offer simplistic solutions to complex problems and create social mechanisms to isolate members from dissent. Cults tend to be totalizing. They interpret everything through one rigid ideological lens. They tend to be coercive. They discourage doubt and punish dissent. They're purity-focused. They impose strict behavioral codes and moral ranking. And they're isolating. They separate adherents from alternative perspectives or sources of meaning. In contrast, healthy religion at its best allows space for inner conscience, questions and reflection, forgiveness and growth, compassion for imperfection. So when a secular ideology becomes institutionally enforced, punishes nonconformity, and allows no redemption, it's not just behaving like religion, it's beginning to resemble something cult-like. Let me be clear, it's not wrong to have such beliefs. The problem isn't the belief system itself. It's how that belief system can capture our institutions, suppress open dialogue, and function as a kind of moral absolutism without being recognized as such. We don't need to demonize the values of justice, inclusion, or equity, but we do need to make room for pluralism, complexity, and disagreement. Because without those things, even the noblest ideas can become oppressive. When we don't recognize cultish ideologies, we leave ourselves vulnerable to indoctrination. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, feel free to share it with someone else or leave me a comment. And let's keep the conversation open. Take care of yourself and each other, and I hope you'll join me next time. Bye for now.